Games Workshop really came through for Necron players in 10th edition. Although we didn't get many models, we got some bangin' rules, including a detachment made specifically for me. Awakened Dynasty, which is all about the boys and the characters. And that's my favorite thing in all of the Necrons. I am this close to having my perfect 2,000 point army list for Necrons. There's just one character I'm missing. And I gotta figure out how to make that character because Games Workshop sort of sells it. Okay, I just double checked. Games Workshop does not sell the Lokhust Lord kit anymore, which is fine because I actually have one, but this is not how I think I'm gonna try to pull off making this character. This might be one of the worst examples of a fine cast kit Games Workshop has ever made. And the saddest part is the casting is okay. No bubbles or egregious mold slips. This is an example of a good cast. Games Workshop is just horrible at making molds. It's absolutely covered in flow gates and air vents. This kit is atrocious. But it does have all the weapon options included, like this little scarab. Currently its rules are the Nano Scarab Amulet, which grants a 5 of Feel No Pain, but back in the Dizzy, this was the Mind Shackle Scarab, who in the fight phase could make enemy models hit themselves. The Necrons are beyond advanced, and mind control is a party trick for them. It's all fun and games until the Demon Prince punches itself. I've got a Lokhust Heavy Destroyer kit. There've always been Heavy Destroyers. There used to be an equally atrocious Finecast upgrade frame for a regular destroyer, but now there's a shiny new box. And I've never got to play with a shiny new box, so this is what I'm gonna use to build my Lokhust Lord. My trio of Lokhust Destroyers need a leader, and the way Games Workshop thinks I do this is to somehow still have one of these Finecast sprues, then have to buy a Lokhust Destroyer set and kit bash the two together. I have other plans. I haven't gotten to experience a lot of the new fancy Necron units. My army is stuck in 2015, but that's what I like. Looking over the sprue, it's an easy to build kit. Games Workshop doesn't really do these anymore except for starter boxes. Cleaning up the Mini, he's a lot like the classic destroyers, but with a lot more parts to make up his floaty centaur body. Even though I don't need to use glue, I did use some glue on some of the key parts of his body, especially any part I wanted to do any gap filling on. Now his not quite legs are done, I can build the man himself. One side of his body has multiple arms and his tiny little noggin, and one thing I had to fix was the little socket that fuels the Gauss Destructor. Since my guy is going to be wielding a stick, he doesn't need this, so I snipped it back into a little Necron vertebrae. If you snip off the peg on his arms, they become ball sockets that actually have quite a bit of posability. I found a pose I like and then flooded these joints with plastic glue to lock them into position. His big arms are gonna wield his staff, and his little arms are gonna hold the Resurrection Orb, the magical Necron crystal balls that give me crazy good reanimation protocols. I have the arms posed, but now I need to make the hands. I drilled out his armholes so that I can put in some wrists. It was tricky finding something the right size, but eventually I found some wire in my collection that I can use to invent some robo wrists. I snipped these a little longer, guesstimating how much I'll need, and I need to make some smaller wrists for his little hand. I've ditched the big old gun, and now my lord is ready for a weapon, and he can have one of two weapons. He can have the Staff of Light, which is not bad. It's a shooting and a melee weapon, but it's a kind of good shooting and a kind of good melee. It's the one my brain wants me to take to get a couple of more good shots out of the squad, because it's a shooty squad, but I actually think the melee weapon is the better choice. You only ever get 4 attacks out of the Lord, but they're really good attacks. Strength 8, AP -3, damage 2. And that can really help out if and when my opponent tries to tie up my big squad of big boys in close combat. The staff that comes in the Finecast kit is cute, but way too small for my lord. My guy is Primaris size, so I needed something bigger and I'll have to invent this. I went through my collection of Necron staff bits and I have a surprising amount of these. But all these staffs are too short, so I decided to scratch build the stick. I took a little length around plastic and marked out 1/16 of an inch all down the length and then threw this into my drill and spun it up. Touching my hobby saw blade, each mark to grind in a notch. This was pretty nerve-wracking because every time there was a better than 0 chance I saw straight through it and ruin it, but quickly I got the hang of it. In a few minutes I had a nice stick and I gave it a light sanding to clean up my work. It's not as perfect as the Games Workshop tubes, but it'll get the job done. Now for the topper. The Games Workshop sticks are too small, and similarly the blades are a little bit too small, but I think if I combine two together, I could have a nice looking Lord's blade. Necron weapons are often symmetrical, so this worked nice. With just a little fussing, I turned a single-sided saber into a double saber. And for the gap in the middle, I took the barrel of a Necron Gauss rifle, clipped out the tube, and then filled up this space. Now that I have the business end of my blade, I clipped it and carefully drilled into my stick and into the blade and inserted a 1mm brass pin. Now for posing, is he stabbing or swinging? This was a tough call, but I decided for swinging. For the bottom, I grabbed the little end of a Staff of Light and pinned this into the bottom. Now to attach this, and I don't have a great way of doing this, I rotated his wrists to match the pose, and then I locked him down with ultra-thin superglue. Then I clipped the wrist to match the angle of the staff, and I glued this on precariously to the ends of the wire with a few drops of superglue. And for the orb, I grabbed an airsoft BB, sanded one bit flat so I could glue it to his little wrist. Now his equipment is physically attached, but it's not very convincing. He's gonna need some hands. I grabbed my milliput and green stuff and mixed 4 balls of the different putties together to make some green-ish stuff. This is a putty that is slightly more sculptable than green stuff. I made a little ball to be his wrist, squishing it over the wire and shaping it into a little half-circle bit, and then I took a big square and wrapped it around the stick to become his fingers. I'm not the most experienced sculptor and hands are probably as hard as it gets, but I kept on trying, poking at the putty with my wet toothpick and sculpting tools, and eventually I had something that was vaguely oven mitt shaped. I pressed my sculpting tools into the mitt to make some fingers, and I got some noodly round appendages, and I poked and prodded until I got some segmented robo digits. My first try turned out fine. Luckily, I get 2 more tries. On the resurrection orb, I started out with a thumb and a big mitt, and before I glued this down, I started to cut out the fingers. I don't know if this was a better approach, but I got 4 things that resemble fingers, and I had a slightly easier time shaping them on the first try. Then for the last hand, I tried to build a little blob that was the shape of fingers wrapped around a staff. I used my hand holding a pen as a guide, and it's actually kind of a square shape, and I did this first and then tried to carve in some lines to separate the fingers. I think this last try was the most successful. All 3 of his hands are kind of different sizes and shapes, but hey, the destroyers are all about modifying their own bodies to better destroy, so it's kinda lore accurate to be a little wonky. Looking at him next to the Games Workshop illustration, I think he looks the part. I have read and reread the Necron lore. It was my first foray into Warhammer 40k. I love the Necron lore so much. The Necrons are sad. They're not even doomed. They are post-doomed. An entire species trapped in unfeeling, unchanging metal bodies, just going through the motions of civilization. And the Destroyers are a very interesting sub-faction within the Necrons. The Destroyer cult has a very simple philosophy. If they don't get to be alive, nothing gets to be alive. And their mission is just to stamp out all life in the galaxy. Very Tyranidy, but even the Tyranid are alive. The Destroyers are not. The Destroyers are just over here punching the grass because its existence insults them. And the rest of the Necrons are kind of just like, we're not with them. Putting together the base, weirdly, the Heavy Destroyer comes with a normal 60mm base, but I want to use the 60mm flying base to better match my older Destroyers. I roughed up the surface so the ground I want to put down will stick. I ripped up some 1/4 inch cork and glued it into a pile in the center of the base, tearing it up and using some scraps to sprinkle around it. Then I mixed up some milliput and put this around the cork to build up the earth and blend the cork into the ground. After that, I used some texture paste to further blend the cork into the ground, and to finish it off, I loaded it up with some wood glue and sprinkled on some basing sands, using a dash of pebbles, some coarse grit sand, and a dunking of fine grit sand. Now to attach my Lord, and I kept it tall in the middle on purpose. I'm gonna use this rock to hide the flying stand. Now Games Workshop has this little nugget in a very interesting spot. This is where you're meant to mount the Lord, but instead I'm gonna put the pin a little further up, using a fat piece of brass. I used ultra-thin superglue to get this pin to stay, and then drilled into my cork tower and stuck down my Lord, floating majestically over the battlefield. Now to get some paint on this sucker. My Necrons are white, but I started out with a black prime. This still makes sure my recesses are nice and dark and saves me a bunch of time painting later. After the black, I zenithalled my mini with some gray paint, leaving some of the black in the recesses and around the rim of his floaty body. Then I zenithalled with pure white over his body in the middle of his torso. Now typically I would throw a very watery Null Oil wash over this sucker, but I want to try something new. I went and stole NYX's black enamel panel liner, which might be the perfect thing for my Necrons. I dripped this into the little veins and dribbled this over the cracks in his armor. This splooged pretty bad, but can easily be fixed with a few dabs of a makeup sponge. And I kept doing this to all the little details in his armor. This will make my recesses really jet black and leave my whites nice and bright. Some of the texture on this fella is pretty subtle, but I was able to get some variation in value by rubbing the enamel into the white paint. Now that the black is on there, I have an idea to get some more texture onto this sucker. Sponging some light gray over his armor and then doing a lighter sponging of white. Although Necrons are immortal and should have perfectly clean armor, the Destroyers don't care about how they look. They just like to destroy. I painted his side panels with black paint, making these little windows dark, and I threw this over his staff and on the jets of his anti-gravity platform. Now all the black and white is done. This Destroyer Lord is very quickly taken shape, and I chalk that up to my color scheme. Since it's white, it's super eye-catching, and it's really easy, because I just painted the white, and now he's like 90% done. This little sucker from my army is going to lead a big 6-man brick of destroyers. Oh, and I'm really excited for him to do so because it's gonna be glorious. A little expensive, it's almost 300 points with the Netherrealm Casket enhancement that I plan to give to him, but it's really good. This big brick of big guys is gonna be my Distraction Carnifex. They have a good amount of anti-Space Marine shooting, but really it's their survivability that has got me excited, and their sheer Necronanity. They can super resurrect. If my opponent really beats up this squad, at the end of their fighting or shooting phase, I can pop Protocol of the Undying Legion to resurrect D3+1. Then at the end of the phase, I can pop the Resurrection Orb for a further D6 reanimation. And then in my command phase, I can resurrect a further D3. That is potentially 13 wounds coming right back to the squad. That is 4 guys that could come right back to life, and then my opponent's just gotta do it all over again. If my Necron Destroyer squad is just getting wailed on all game, I am perfectly happy because that means the rest of my army is not. They're just marching up the board, winning me the game. But before I do that, I gotta get some color on this guy. And before I do that, I gotta tell you about EonsOfBattle.com. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch, like our new Nick and Jay dice, and is the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members will get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain pack or any previous pack we have ever made. This May, we're delving back into the Hungry Maw with the Infested Colony, a world recently ravaged by the chitinous teeth and claws of the Endless Swarm. A series of ruined buildings crumbling under the weight of hypercharged plant growth and impaled by alien limbs. And shipping containers that have been ripped to shreds or torn open from the inside out. These relics of an alien war are designed with competitive wargaming in mind and an eye for storytelling, matching perfectly with our previous alien hive colony. With this set, you can build a wargaming table dripping with alien atmosphere. The color of my Necrons is red, yellow, and lots of orange. To start out, I airbrushed some red onto his balls to make sure they have a lovely red glow. Then I prepared my palette with my warms, a lovely fall palette, going from a warm brown all the way up to a bright yellow white. Since my scheme comes together so quickly, I feel like I have room to really spend some quality time on the weapons. I started off base coating my sword with a dark red, and then quickly before the paint is finished drying, I come in with a red and blend these two colors together to start my transition. Then I do the same with orange and yellow, finishing it off with tips of warm white. I like to get all my colors down to see what it looks like. Once I got something, then I can do some editing. I went back and forth over my candy corn Necron blade, glazing in my colors to smooth out my transitions and alter the look of the blade, making the tang a little redder and the blade a little yellower. Then I carefully hit the edges with some warm white, and I dripped this into the recesses of his Necron tubes, letting it build up in the recesses. Then I took my colors and put these over the ribbing of the shaft of his sword. I hit the Necron glyph with some yellow, and the sword is complete. Now to hit his other bits. I did the same thing to his balls, doing some wet blending from dark red to warm white, and the balls are easier than his sword. Just a few layers of glazing and then they're perfect. And for the glyphs on his body, I decided these will be red too. I started off with a base coat of orange, and then red on the edges, and then I went over the middle with some warm whites to make it look like these are red hot glowing coils. And I can't forget about my Necron special ball, the Resorb. This thing will give me, on average, 1 whole destroyer back during a reanimation protocol. I spruced up my Necron's shaft with a glazing of yellow, and I used black to clean up his stick, and some gray to do some highlights, not letting it get too bright. I want the high contrast of his white body and dark details. Now for the base, and my Necron bases are easy. I sprayed tan all over the base, and then I mixed up a slurry of red pigment powder. I slobbered this all over the base to get it Chef Boyardee red, and then spritzed it with water to get the pigments to flow off the raised areas and settle in the cracks of the sand and the cork. Once that was dry, I dusted it with some Indian yellow ink to pump up the vibrancy, and then my custom one-of-a-kind, never-before-seen Lord is ready for the tabletop. I have finished the angriest little robot, and comparing mine to the GW original, I like mine a lot better. Although I do have that original Booger Finecast one, I might end up building that one day just because I do like the history of Warhammer models, so that'd be a fun one to have in the collection. But I prefer this guy. Now that I know Games Workshop doesn't sell the Lokhust Destroyer anymore, it's making me a little bit nervous for my army, although Games Workshop really likes destroyers. These guys are the original destroyers, but they're now called the Lokhust Destroyers, and there's 3 more flavors. There's the Ophidian Destroyer, which is a close combat destroyer, the Skorpek, which is also a close combat destroyer, and the Hexmark, which is a really weird shooty guy with a bunch of pistols. For my army, I plan on having a big squad of Lokhust Destroyers led by the new Lord, and I already have a 6-man squad of Skorpeks led by a Skorpek Lord, and it's gonna be a fun little competition in my army of which squad of destroyers can do the most destroying. If I had to guess, it'd probably be the Locusts. Thanks for watching.